One letter, 4 bishops, 15,000 witnesses in a Swiss meadow. And after all of it, after the pleading and the warning and the answer that came anyway, the Vatican said almost nothing at all. Not the silence of indifference, the silence that follows a door closing softly when everyone in the house has heard it and no one wants to be the first to speak. That is where this begins. To understand why a single letter could carry so much weight, it helps to understand what it means, inside the Catholic Church, to tear something that is supposed to be seamless. The Church has survived councils, wars, plagues, and centuries of internal argument without breaking apart entirely, because at the center of its self-understanding sits one stubborn conviction that unity is not a preference, it is a mark of the faith itself, one of the 4 qualities every Catholic recites in the Creed without a second thought. 1. Holy, Catholic, Apostolic. When a pope uses the word schism, he is not reaching for a bureaucratic term. He is naming the one wound the institution has always considered nearly unthinkable to inflict on itself. And in the summer of 2026, for the second time in less than 4 decades, that unthinkable wound opened again in the same country, on the same soil, among the descendants of the same community. For decades, the Society of St. Pius X existed in a strange kind of limbo, neither fully outside the Catholic Church nor fully inside it, a traditionalist fraternity founded in 1970 by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a man who died in 1991, still convinced that the reforms of the Second Vatican Council had wounded the faith he had spent his life defending. Lefebvre had been a missionary archbishop, a man formed in the Church of the 1930s and 1940s, and when the Council of the 1960s reshaped the liturgy, redefined the Church's posture toward the modern world, and opened new conversations with other Christian communities and other faiths, he came to believe something essential had been lost. He founded his society not as a rebellion, in his own telling, but as a rescue operation, a lifeboat meant to preserve the Latin Mass and the theological formation he believed Rome itself was abandoning. For nearly 2 decades, the society existed in an uneasy but tolerated space, its priests ordained, its seminaries full, its relationship with Rome tense but not yet broken. In 1988, Lefebvre did what Rome had begged him not to do. He consecrated 4 bishops without papal permission, and the Vatican answered with excommunication. It was a rupture that shaped Catholic life for a generation, a scar that popes after him tried, in different ways, to heal. Pope Benedict XVI, who as a young theologian had lived through the very council that Lefebvre rejected, and who understood better than most the ache of watching a community drift from the center, later lifted those excommunications, hoping reconciliation might still be possible, hoping that time and patience might do what argument could not. For years afterward, the society lived in that in-between space, celebrating its Latin Mass, training its seminarians, waiting for a settlement that never quite arrived. Popes visited the question. Cardinals negotiated, documents were exchanged, positions clarified, doctrinal disagreements catalogued and recatalogued. And still, the deeper question sat unresolved. Was the society inside the Church, tolerated but irregular, or was it something else, something that only looked like communion from a distance? Then, in the summer of 2026, the wound reopened. The society announced it would consecrate 4 more bishops, again without a papal mandate. Again at its seminary in Econ, Switzerland, the same soil where Lefebvre had defied Rome 38 years earlier. And into that gathering storm walked a pope who had, until that point, spent his first year in office learning the weight of the office he now carried. Pope Leo XIV, the first American ever elected to the papacy, had entered his pontificate the year before, with a reputation as a careful, measured administrator, a man more comfortable with governance than with grand public gestures. He had said as much himself, acknowledging early in his tenure that he had a real learning curve ahead of him when it came to functioning as the head of a sovereign state as much as a spiritual shepherd. Few observers expected his first real test of authority to arrive not from a foreign government or a geopolitical crisis, but from a small, fiercely devoted community of priests who had spent 2 generations insisting they alone had kept the faith intact. Pope Leo XIV had already tried, quietly, to stop what was coming. In February, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the prefect of the Vatican's doctrine office, met personally with Father Davide Pagliarani, the Society's superior general, and proposed something delicate, a structured theological dialogue on the condition that the July consecrations be suspended. It was, in its own way, a generous offer, an invitation to talk through the very doctrinal disagreements that had kept the Society at arm's length from Rome for decades, issues that Fernandez described as not yet sufficiently clarified between the two sides. The offer was declined. Pagliarani's response left the door only barely open, and the Society's preparations for a cone continued without pause. On June 16th, Leo warned publicly that the plan risked schism and that Rome was preparing one last appeal. Everyone understood what that meant. There would be one more letter, and then there would be nothing left to say. The days that followed were not loud. There were no press conferences, no ultimatums shouted from balconies. Instead, there was the slow, deliberate work of a pope choosing his words with the kind of care usually reserved for a eulogy, knowing that whatever he wrote next would likely be read, studied, and remembered for years, regardless of which way the Society ultimately turned. That letter arrived on June 30th, the eve of the ceremony, on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, the two apostles the Church remembers as the pillars of its unity. The timing was not incidental. A pope writing to a group he feared was about to break away from Rome, choosing the one day of the year set aside to honor the men who built that unity in the first place. The Vatican published the text that same day, and for anyone who had followed Leo's first year, the tone was unmistakable. This was not a legal document. It was a plea. He wrote to Pagliarani directly, and through him to every bishop, priest, seminarian, and layperson connected to the Society. He acknowledged what was real and good in their devotion, the discipline of their liturgical life, their commitment to priestly formation, the seriousness with which they approached the faith. He did not pretend the Society was without substance, and he did not open his appeal with condemnation. He opened it with recognition, noting that his own predecessors had shown an attentive and generous attitude toward the Society precisely because of the devotion he now praised. It was a strategic choice as much as a pastoral one. A man who wants to be heard by someone he is about to correct does not begin by insulting them. He begins by telling them what he sees that is good, and then, having said what was true, he asked for what he wanted most. In this spirit, and filled with Christian affection, I plead with you, and ask you with all my heart, please turn back. It is a strange thing to hear from the mouth of an institution as vast and formal as the Roman Catholic Church, a plea written not in the language of canon law, but in the language of a father standing at a door he cannot force open. There was no hedging in that sentence, no diplomatic softening. Three verbs of longing stacked one on top of the other, plead, ask with all my heart, aimed at a single request 4 words long. Please turn back. Leo warned them plainly of what the act would cost, not in political terms, but in sacramental ones. He wrote that the consecrations would deprive the faithful of the licit, and in some cases even the valid, reception of the sacraments they loved and depended on for their own sanctification. This was not an abstract warning. For a community built entirely around the conviction that it alone preserved the true form of Catholic worship, the idea that its own actions might sever ordinary believers from the sacraments they had spent their lives defending was meant to land as a genuine wound, not a threat, but a mirror. And then came the line that would follow this story for weeks afterward, the line that turned a canonical dispute into something closer to grief. I pray for you, because to tear the seamless garment of Christ is a sin of extreme gravity. The seamless garment. It is an image drawn from the Gospel of John, the tunic Christ wore to his crucifixion, woven in one piece, without seam, so precious that the soldiers at the foot of the cross would not cut it apart, choosing instead to cast lots for it whole. For 2,000 years, that garment has stood as a symbol of the Church's unity, something that resists being divided without being destroyed. Leo did not accuse the Society of ambition or rebellion. He accused them, gently and devastatingly, of tearing something that was never meant to be cut. The reply came the same afternoon. Pagliarani did not let a full day pass before answering, and his letter was, in its own way, just as sincere. He thanked Leo for his fatherly concern. He insisted, with evident conviction, that what the society was about to do was not an act of schism at all. "Far be it from us to separate ourselves from the Roman Church," he wrote. "We desire, on the contrary, to serve her by means that are extraordinary, as one would assist a mother in distress who requires particular help, even if such help is not understood by everyone." It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, because it reveals exactly how far apart the two men truly were, even as both reached for the language of family to explain themselves. Leo saw a garment being torn. Pagliarani saw a mother being rescued. Neither man was lying. Neither man was posturing for effect. They were simply standing on opposite sides of the same wound, each convinced he was the one trying to close it. And then he said something that made the distance even clearer, something that should have been a warning to anyone still hoping for a change of course. Pagliarani also urged Leo to reconsider the excommunications that would follow, as if the punishment itself was the injustice, not the act that would trigger it. It was a letter written by a man who had already made his decision, wrapped in the vocabulary of a man still asking to be understood. The next morning, July 1st, the ceremony happened exactly as planned. 15,000 people were expected to gather in the meadow at Écône, the same field where Lefebvre had performed his own defiant consecrations in 1988, a field that by now had become something close to sacred ground for the movement, a place pilgrims within the society speak of the way other Catholics speak of Lourdes or Fatima. Buses arrived from across Europe. Families who had driven through the night stood shoulder to shoulder on the grass, many of them too young to remember the original 1988 rupture, except as a story told at their own dinner tables, passed down the way other families passed down memories of war or exile. And the society did not simply repeat history in spirit, they repeated it in objects. The throne used by the main consecrator that day was the very throne Lefebvre himself had sat in 38 years earlier, brought out of storage and set again at the center of the meadow. The vestments worn by the 4 new bishops were the same vestments worn by the bishops consecrated in 1988, fabric that had waited decades in a vestry for this exact morning. Nothing about the staging was accidental. This was not a group stumbling into rupture, caught off guard by the consequences of their own decision. This was a community choosing, with full ceremonial precision, to stand exactly where their founder had once stood, in the same clothes, on the same throne, making the same choice all over again, as if history itself had been folded carefully and kept ready in a drawer for this single day. Catholic commentators watching from outside noted the echo immediately, and inside the community itself, there was no attempt to hide what everyone already understood. Jokes began circulating among some in the society itself, wry, half-serious lines like "party like it's 1988" and "1988 copy-paste," a kind of gallows humor that admitted, more honestly than any official statement could, that they knew exactly what they were repeating and exactly what it would cost. There is something almost unbearably human in that detail, the laughter that shows up right at the edge of a decision people know cannot be undone. Not mockery of what was happening, but a kind of nervous recognition, the sound people make when they have already chosen and are only now beginning to feel the size of it. The cost came quickly. The same provision of canon law that had triggered the 1988 excommunications was applied again. And the 6 bishops involved in the 2026 consecrations, the 4 newly consecrated men and the bishops who had laid hands on them, found themselves in the same position their predecessors had occupied a generation earlier. Outside the visible unity of the Church they insisted they had never intended to leave. The Vatican did not need to deliberate for long. Within days it issued its decree, declaring the society to be in a state of schism, a formal rupture from the Catholic Church. It was the outcome Leo had spent his letter begging them to avoid, delivered now not as a threat, but as a description of what had already happened. A pope who had written "Please turn back" on June 30th was, by the first week of July, signing a document that confirmed no one had. And this is where the story could have ended, with a decree, a punishment, a chapter closed. But the society did not accept the closing. On July 3rd, Pagliarani wrote again, this time not to plead but to reject. In a letter addressed directly to Pope Leo XIV, released publicly that day, he called the sanctions imposed on the society objectively unjust and invalid. Two words chosen with obvious care, because to call a Vatican decree merely unjust would be one kind of protest, an appeal to fairness that still, in theory, recognized the authority making the ruling. To call it invalid was something else entirely, a claim that the decree itself carried no binding force at all, that Rome had in effect spoken without the power to make its words stick. He framed the consecrations not as disobedience, but as necessity. An extreme measure to save souls amid the doctrinal and moral confusion in which the Church finds itself. Read carefully. That sentence performs a quiet reversal of the entire crisis. Leo had described the consecrations as a sin against unity. Pagliarani described them as an act of rescue, positioning the society not as the source of confusion, but as its remedy, the last steady hand in a church he believed was losing its footing. He insisted the society had no intention of replacing the church it claimed to serve. "We in no way intend to replace the church," he wrote, "and our sole purpose is to remain faithful to her." What he didn't do, in that second letter, was answer the plea Leo had made 3 days earlier. He didn't respond to, "Please turn back." He didn't respond to the seamless garment. He responded to the punishment, but not to the sorrow that had preceded it. It was as though two letters had passed each other in the dark, one written in the language of the heart, the other answered in the language of law, each man convinced he had spoken plainly and been misheard. Perhaps the most human moment in the entire crisis came not from either of the two men at its center, but from someone standing just outside the frame. Marc-André Mabillard, the Society's media manager, the person whose job it was to explain and defend the consecrations to the wider world, the one tasked with turning theology into talking points for journalists who did not know the difference between licit and valid, allowed something softer to slip through the official language. He expressed what he called great sadness to not be understood by our leader, and in the same breath insisted, "We are changing absolutely nothing in our plans." It is a small detail, easy to miss inside a story built from canon law and papal letters, but it may be the truest sentence anyone said that week. A man who believed sincerely that he was misunderstood by the very person who had just called his community's actions a sin of extreme gravity. Not defiance dressed as certainty, sadness sitting right next to resolve, refusing to leave. He didn't soften the outcome. He simply admitted, in one breath, that being right and being sad were not mutually exclusive, that a person could carry both at once and still walk forward. It is worth remembering what all of this happened alongside, because it did not occur in isolation. Just days before the letter to Pagliarani, Leo had presided over an extraordinary consistory of cardinals, held June 26th and 27th, a gathering of the princes of the church, men who had elected him only a year earlier and who now sat with him as the SSPX crisis moved toward its final hour. Concern about the coming consecrations had already been quietly raised by a number of participants, even though no formal statement emerged from the meeting itself. It would have been easy in that room for Leo to let the cardinals absorb some of the weight, to let a collective voice share the burden of what was coming. He did not. The Pope was carrying this weight into a room full of the very men who had elected him, and choosing, even there, not to make a spectacle of it. He waited. He let the Vatican publish his letter to the Society on its own terms, on the feast of Peter and Paul, timed not for maximum attention but for maximum meaning, a choice that says something about a man more interested in being understood by history than by that week's news cycle. And then, once the schism was declared, once the letters had been exchanged and the excommunications applied, something changed in how the Vatican carried itself. There was no triumphant statement, no extended commentary explaining, justifying, or relitigating what had happened in that Swiss meadow. Leo, by most accounts, began the following days preparing for something almost startlingly ordinary, a summer vacation. On July 5th, he moved to the Apostolic Palace at Castel Gandolfo, the historic papal retreat south of Rome, becoming the first pope to stay there since 2012. Pope Francis, for the entirety of his 12-year pontificate, had avoided the residence altogether, turning its grand rooms into a public museum instead of a papal getaway, a choice that had, in its own time, said something about the kind of Pope Francis wanted to be. Leo chose differently. He appeared on the balcony overlooking the town's piazza to greet the residents who had gathered below, offered a blessing, and settled into a place popes had used as a countryside refuge for over 400 years, a place once favored by Benedict XVI and by saints before him, a place where tennis courts and quiet gardens sit only a short walk from rooms where popes have prayed through their own private storms for centuries. There's a detail here that deserves more than a passing mention. Leo did not simply take a holiday, he chose to spend it, deliberately, in the grander apostolic residence overlooking Lake Alban, rather than the smaller villa on the same estate where he had spent his days off during his first year in office. It was, in effect, a decision to occupy the fuller weight of the role. The same summer he had just exercised one of the most consequential judgments a pope can make. A coincidence of timing, perhaps. Or perhaps a man who, having just closed one door with a heavy hand, wanted the space and the quiet to feel the full size of what closing it had cost him. It would be easy to read that as simple coincidence, a pope taking a scheduled break after a difficult season. But watch the timing closely, and something more deliberate comes into focus. A week after telling one of the oldest fractures in the modern church, "Please turn back," and hearing, in return, "We are changing absolutely nothing," Leo walked into silence on his own terms. Not the silence of retreat from a fight he had lost, but the silence of a man who had said everything he needed to say and now needed, simply, to be still. During his first Sunday Angelus from Castel Gandolfo on July 12th, he did not revisit the schism at all. He spoke instead about rest, inviting the faithful to make time this summer for what he called meaningful moments of silence and prayer. Vatican watchers who had spent the previous fortnight parsing canonical language about validity and licitness now heard a pope who sounded for a moment less like a head of state managing a crisis and more like a shepherd reminding his flock and perhaps reminding himself that stillness is not the same as defeat. That contrast is the real hinge of this story. A biographer of Pope Francis, reflecting on Leo's first year, observed that almost no one had expected this kind of decisiveness from him. Many had predicted a quiet pontificate focused inward, on reform and governance, rather than a pope willing to set the agenda on the world stage. Instead, the opposite happened. The area where Leo had least confidence when he was elected, the role of international statesman, became the very place his pontificate found its clearest voice. He had spent the first half of 2026 speaking on artificial intelligence, on war, on questions far beyond the walls of the Vatican, carrying himself with a governing style that left even seasoned Vatican watchers describing him as dizzying to keep up with. A pope who set his own agenda rather than simply fulfilling the calendar his predecessor had left behind. And now, in the space of 1 week, he had written the most personal letter of his pontificate to a group preparing to break from Rome, watched them do it anyway, allowed his church to declare the rupture official, and then gone quiet, deliberately, at a lakeside palace that hadn't hosted a pope's summer in 14 years. It is tempting, watching a story like this from the outside, to want a villain. Coverage of the crisis tended to sort itself along familiar lines, some accounts framing the society as stubborn and self-righteous, others framing Rome as heavy-handed, unwilling to make room for a community that only wanted to preserve what it loved. But sit with the letters themselves for a moment, not the headlines built from them, and the villain is harder to find. A pope who called the society's devotion real before he ever mentioned punishment. A superior general who thanked that same pope for his fatherly concern even while refusing to yield. A media spokesman who admitted sadness in the very breath he used to announce that nothing would change. These are not the words of people trying to hurt each other. They are the words of people who wanted, very badly, to be understood, and discovered that wanting it was not the same as achieving it. There is a version of this story that ends in anger, a pope betrayed, a community punished, a door slammed on both sides. That is not, in the end, what happened. What happened was quieter, and in its way, sadder. Two men, each convinced he was protecting something precious, one convinced he was defending a mother in distress, the other convinced he was refusing to let a seamless garment be torn, wrote to each other with real feeling and arrived at the same conclusion anyway. The consecrations happened, the schism was declared, and the Vatican, having said everything it had to say through one extraordinary letter, chose not to keep saying it. It let the silence stand. Perhaps that is the only kind of ending a wound like this can have for now, not resolution, but restraint, the choice to stop pulling at a tear rather than risk widening it further. History suggests these ruptures do not stay frozen forever. It took decades and a change of popes before Rome and the society found even the narrow bridge of lifted excommunications the last time this happened. No one watching Castel Gandolfo this July could say with certainty whether a similar bridge will ever be built again, or how long it might take, or who might be alive to see it finished. What can be said is smaller and perhaps more durable than any prediction. A pope pleaded with all his heart, and when that heart was not enough to change what was coming, he still found it in himself to bless a crowd from a balcony and to ask his people, in the middle of a fractured summer, to simply sit for a while in silence and pray. Not a demand for outrage, not a call to take sides, just an invitation to be still, offered by a man who had just spent a week discovering exactly how much stillness a broken heart requires before it can speak again. If this story moved you, consider staying close to what happens next, because a wound like this rarely stays quiet for long. Leave a word below about the moment in this story that struck you most, and God bless.